All right, guys, welcome back. Great Depression. So we just talked about the Roaring Twenties. We talked about how banks were giving out money. Buying on credit was a big deal. And that was probably one of the biggest problems with what caused the Great Depression. Remember Chow line, okay? Chow, C-H-O-W. Those are the causes of the Great Depression. If you know them, say them with me. C, crash of the stock market. H, high tariffs and war debts. O, overproduction of farm products. W, wealth inequality. So all those things we're going to build up to a Great Depression. And so we need some solutions. President Herbert Hoover believed in something called rugged individualism, and he said America's going to get itself out of this. You don't need the government to help out. And what we found out was, yes, we do. This is something that's never happened in history, and we need the government to step in and do something about it. So Herbert Hoover refused to, and remember him, Hoover. Hoover's a vacuum cleaner. Vacuum cleaners, what do? They suck. Hoover sucked. So Hoover really didn't do much for the Great Depression. Who is, though, is a guy named FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay. Basically, here's the problem. No one is spending money. Our economy needs people to spend money. So what do, Mr. President? Well, let's create some jobs. So his solution, he had three parts: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief is when he sort of gave money out to people short term. Let's give them some help, and they'll get back on their feet, and maybe they'll be able to sort of find a job. Okay, there weren't a lot of those programs. Reform is when there's a change, where we're going to do something or create some sort of organization that's going to keep America from having another Great Depression. Recovery, at least as far as I understand it and think about it, is jobs. Something to do with jobs. That's the one we need the most. We need to recover from the Great Depression and make sure we don't have another one. So here's just a few examples of recovery programs. The Tennessee Valley Authority. It creates jobs in the poorest parts of our nation, creating dams to create hydroelectric power, creates jobs. Great idea. People are going to spend money. The WPA, Works Progress Administration. These are jobs for artists, nurses, libraries, etc. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. This is really relief. It basically paid farmers not to farm. And that sounds crazy. But farmers had produced so much in World War I, and then when World War I ended, they still had all these crops, and there wasn't as big a demand, so the price fell, and they were selling their crops for 10% of what they used to. They couldn't sell their crops, but they were kind of stuck. Well, I can't not sell my crops, but if I do sell my crops, I'm not going to get anything for them. So the government stepped in and said, we'll pay you not to grow certain crops in an effort to bring prices up. So it did help. Okay. The CCC, Civilian Conservationist Corps. It's going to help create jobs in places like national parks, to create roads and fire towers and things like that. So again, short-term jobs, but it gets people spending money. Okay. Reform programs. Two of the biggest ones were the FDIC, Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation, which provides insurance to people who put their money in banks. So when you put your money in a bank today, if someone robs the bank or somehow the company that runs the bank goes out of business, you don't lose your money. If the government has insured it with the FDIC, it's safe. Okay. So people feel safe to put their money in banks now. And the biggest one, which we still use today, is SSA, the Social Security Act, which provides retirement money for the elderly. Okay, so at the time, old people couldn't find a job, so this is a sort of retirement system, and we still use it today. Okay, so let's talk about deficit spending. First of all, where does money come from to pay for all this stuff? Okay, all these jobs and all these programs and Social Security. Well, the government had to stimulate the economy by paying people so they could help the economy recover. So it's like jump-starting the economy. You got to spend money to make money. So the government goes into debt, paying people for jobs, and this leads to huge deficit or debt. But people having money to spend leads to more people having jobs and more working hours, which leads to more people having confidence and making purchases, which leads to more jobs and more taxes, which leads to less of a deficit. Basically, FDR understood that we have to spend money to help people out, to get the economy back up, and then once we get it back up, we can tax people more, and we'll be able to bring this debt down. The same thing happened when President Barack Obama took over, when he did what he called the stimulus package. We had a horrible recession when he took over, He's got to get the economy going. So what's he do? He tries to stimulate the economy and give money to people and businesses. And then eventually we can start taxing people more because the economy's strong and get some of that lost money back. So you have to go in a deficit, spend money to make money. Okay. All right. We're talking about World War II now. World War II, it's a huge section. You need to study it on Quizlet or your notes. We're not going to go over some of the bigger things. But just like World War I, World War II, we wanted to stay out of it. We wanted it to be neutral, so we call that isolationism. Even the Congress passed laws to help us stay out of it, called the Neutrality Acts. But FDR still wanted to help our allies, France and Great Britain, so he found ways to get around these laws. The law says you can't sell weapons, you can't sell stuff to our friends. Okay, so FDR says, all right, I'll let them borrow some stuff, or I'll trade some stuff. And this was technically not against the law. So Lend-Lease is when we let them borrow stuff, and in exchange they gave it back after the end of the war. And the Destroyers for Bases was a plan where we traded stuff to our allies, France and Great Britain. So again, it was a way for us to get around the laws. FDR knew that we were eventually going to be involved, but he still had to obey the Neutrality Acts. Okay. So on December 1941, December 7th, a date that will live in infamy, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and now it's on. America finally gets involved in World War II, and we go to work. Okay. So some of the reasons that FDR said we should go to war in the first place were what he calls the four freedoms. Freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom from fear, freedom from want. These are all the reasons that we need to be involved to protect all people from these things that they're being deprived of. Okay. One of the big things that happened in World War II, pretty amazing, was what we call the Office of War Mobilization. Our whole economy shifted from peacetime to wartime. We went from making cars in factories to making tanks. We went from making dresses in factories to making uniforms. And so the Office of War Mobilization was in charge of everything that had to do with creating or saving or recycling anything for the war. The War Industries Board, the Office of Price Administrations, these were underneath the Office of War Mobilization, and they were in charge of things like recycling programs, rationing programs, where you had to use a stamp to buy certain things like coffee or sugar or gasoline. Okay? All these industries were working with the Office of War Mobilization to make sure everything we were doing at home was going to help us win the war. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Old people, what could they do? They could buy war bonds, help support the war. Young people, kids, what could they do? They could run around town and collect scrap metal and tires and newspaper and wood. Okay? Women, what could women do? Well, heck yeah, women were in the factories working. Okay? Everybody helped out in World War II, and that's really the reason we were most successful. Okay? So as far as the war goes, there were a lot of big personalities in the wars. There were some major conferences in World War II. These are all kind of confusing, so pay attention. One of the first one was called the Munich Conference of 1938. This was before the war even broke out, and a lot of European countries thought if we just let Hitler have what he wants, then maybe he'll be nice. And they did. They gave him what he wanted. They let him take a country called Czechoslovakia, hoping it would make him happy and avoid future conflict. This is called appeasement. This is, again, like you give your little niece or nephew some candy because they're acting a fool. Let me have some candy. Let me have some candy. Let me have some candy. Let me have... Look, if I give you some candy, would you shut up? Yes, I'll be good. And you know, just like I know, as soon as you give that kid that candy, in about 5 minutes, they're going to start being bad. Okay? Same thing. These European nations thought if they just give Hitler what he wants, he'll be good. Appeasement. That didn't work. Okay? So obviously, a year after that, Hitler invaded Poland, and they were like, oh crap, we shouldn't have given him what he wanted. So they found out that appeasement didn't work. The Tehran Conference, okay, of 1943. This is when the war's going pretty good. America's finally joined the war. And so you have the big three, Churchill, FDR, Stalin. They meet, and they plan out a strategy on how to deal with Germany. How do you get into Germany to take Hitler out? Well, first of all, you got to get into France. So how are we going to get into France? Well, they planned the strategy which became known as D-Day or Operation Overlord. And a way to remember the Tehran Conference is think they ran. They ran up those beaches to bust into France so we could finally get into Germany. Okay, the Yalta Conference of 1945. This one was almost at the end of the war, and this was how do we deal with Germany at the end of World War II? What do we need to do as far as how to prevent another world war? We can't do another Treaty of Versailles. It's going to lead to another world war. So think of Yalta as your alternative plan for all of Germany. And one of the big things was we're going to divide Germany up, and then we're going to have each Allied leader take a section. Okay, Potsdam Conference of 1945. This one is going to finalize plans on how to divide Germany. It's also going to give Japan a final warning that you better surrender or you're going to face prompt and utter destruction. So those are sort of the conferences of World War II. Okay. Speaking of World War II, the most secretive project in history was called the Manhattan Project. It was the secret project to build a nuclear weapon and use it. And so we did use it, obviously, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended the war almost immediately, and Japan surrendered unconditionally. Okay, we used 2 of them because they wouldn't surrender after 1. Okay, something else important to understand is after World War II, before FDR died, he had plans on creating a successful peacekeeping organization. This time it's called the United Nations. This time it's going to have a peacekeeping force to enforce policies. This time it's going to have strong countries in it to prevent future wars. And for the most part, it's been pretty successful. We haven't had another world war, okay? And inside the United Nations, after World War II, we're going to have 2 sides, kind of like cliques. We're going to have NATO, which is democratic countries who are on America's side during the Cold War. And then we're going to have what we call the Warsaw Pact, which are going to be communist countries that are on Russia's or the Soviet Union side in World War II. So even though we ended World War II, because of the way we ended it, because of this nuclear weapon, Russia wants one, and it basically starts a beef between us and Russia, and that's one of the primary reasons that we had a Cold War between them and us for 45 years. The other major reason is because we didn't like how they liked government, communism. They didn't like our version of government, which was democracy. Okay. Taking a break. We're going to come back and talk about the Cold War after this. Stay tuned.